It looks like we're still growing. Okay. Well, as people are still kind of wandering into our Zoom room, we'd like to start. So first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Siva Nam, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience here at the University of Chicago, and a member of the Trauma Interest Work Group Steering Committee. We are so pleased today to have Dr. Emiliana Vegas from the Brookings Institute join us to discuss the unequal impact of COVID-19 school closures around the world, particularly the lasting effect these school closures have had on disadvantaged families and children in low-income households. Before I say a bit more about Dr. Vegas and her work, we'd like to do a quick audience poll to get a sense of who's joining us today, in addition to Stranger Things. So I think we'll have our poll. Thank you, Diana. We have a Zoom poll. If you could just take a moment and tell us who you are, if you're part of the university, faculty, staff, if you're a student, if you're an external researcher, parent, teacher, member of our community, or identify elsewhere. Okay. And while you're taking this moment to respond, I'll share a little bit about the speaker series and some event housekeeping. So first of all, the Trauma Interest Working Group promotes a scientific, interdisciplinary understanding of trauma to improve health equity on the South Side of Chicago and beyond. We do this through education, scholarship, clinical care, community engagement, and advocacy. A little bit of housekeeping. Please take a moment to mute yourself if you haven't already. For questions, feel free to place some questions in the chat box during our presentation, or use your little icon to raise your hand in the Zoom during our Q&A feature. And if you haven't already noted, this event will be recorded. The video will be available in the future on Mansueto Institute's YouTube channel. If you'd like to join our listserv, please do so. Sign up on the Trauma Interest Work Group listserv by visiting list.uchicago.edu and just select Trauma Interest TWG. Our next event for our Trauma Interest Work Group speaker series will be in May, and details will be forthcoming. Okay, so let's check those poll results. See who's here. Okay, so we've got equal balance of faculty and community members. Wonderful to have a broad group. We've got a lot of unidentified participants, so great. We've got a potpourri of folks joining us today. Some staff, some students, some researchers, and some educators, which is wonderful. Thank you all for joining us today. It's nice to have a broad range of participants to draw from. Okay, now on to our featured speaker, Dr. Vegas. We're very honored to have her here today. She's the co-director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institute. Dr. Vegas joined Brookings in 2019 after spending 20 years working in multilateral development institutions, where she has led research, operations, and teams focused on improving education, educational policies, and programs in developing countries. She has written extensively on issues affecting education systems in Latin America, the Caribbean, and other developing regions. Her papers and books cover topics ranging from policies to raising teacher effectiveness, school finance, and early childhood development. She has a Doctor of Education degree from Harvard University, a Master's of Public Policy degree from Duke University, a bachelor's degree in communications from the Andre Bello Catholic University in Caracas, Venezuela. On a personal note, we are very excited that her son, Tobias Abelman, is part of the University of Chicago class of 2024, so a real member of our community. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Vegas. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to join you today. I will begin sharing my screen right now. Hopefully you can see it. So as Siva mentioned, I will be speaking about the unequal impact of the COVID-19 pandemic related school closures around the globe. And this work really, I'm summarizing research that we've been doing at Brookings and with colleagues from the World Bank on different parts of the problem related to education. So the first thing that we are documenting is the impact on inequality, which was already pre-existing prior to the pandemic, but that the school closures related to the pandemic is really accelerating. And I'll give you some overview of the impact that that may have long term. And then I'll focus the rest of the presentation on a more optimistic work that I've done with my co-director of the Center for Universal Education, Rebecca Winthrop, where we've put out a piece really focusing on beyond reopening schools, how can education emerge stronger post-COVID-19? And there we really look at some of the trends that we're observing around the world that may help achieve some of the more important transformations in education that had been sort of the evidence we're suggesting should happen, but were very difficult to introduce. And COVID and the school closures forced by COVID may present an unparalleled opportunity to really transform education moving forward. So in terms of accelerating inequality, before the pandemic, the World Bank estimated that over half of 10-year-old children in low and middle income countries did not read well enough to comprehend basic text, or did not even attend school. This is what they coined the learning poverty, and they called the situation worldwide a learning crisis in their World Development Report of 2018. Now, more recently, given the school closures and depending on the scenarios of the length of them, the bank is estimating that this figure will increase to at a minimum 63%. So imagine that, close to 2/3 of the world's children not only don't have access to school, but even when they do by age 10, they don't have the basic skill to continue learning throughout their lifetime that will really limit their potential to be active citizens, to be productive employers or employees, and to really contribute to their societies and reach their full potential. And the fact, as I mentioned, is that countries differed widely in their pre-pandemic school quality and capacity to provide quality educational opportunities even before COVID-19. And that is affecting their ability to continue providing these opportunities throughout the pandemic. We talked about the digital divide, which is so evident in the United States, but especially across the world by level of income. And I'm going to give you an example of two countries that I think are quite illuminating, because they are two island countries with different levels of income, but Singapore is classified by the World Bank as a high-income country, whereas Dominican Republic is classified as an upper middle income country, so not one of the poorest countries in the world. And what this graph shows is prior to the pandemic, when the last program of international student assessment, also known as PISA, was conducted. This is an assessment of students who are 15-year-old who are attending school. And here are all the 75 or so countries that participated or jurisdictions. I don't want you to try and read all the names, but what I want you to notice is that the red bar on the almost very top is Singapore, and their students scored among the highest performing students in the world. And the green bar at the very bottom is the Dominican Republic, where their students, over 80% of them, didn't achieve the basic level of mathematics proficiency. And these were students, as I mentioned, who are 15 years old and are currently in school. And the Dominican Republic has high rates of dropout, whereas Singapore does not. So even prior to the pandemic, these were wide difference. Now, let's see what's happening during the pandemic. And just in terms of what was the response of the governments. So in Singapore, the flag on the right, the government closed schools, as did governments worldwide. As you all may know, in March, around March 12th of 2020, over 1.6 billion learners were left out of school. However, in countries like Singapore, they were able to return to in-person instruction on June 2nd. And many of them, the majority of them, had access to remote learning opportunities between the period when schools were forced to close down due to the health crisis to when they were able to return to school. Huge difference with the Dominican Republic, where the schools also closed around March 12th, but a very small fraction of their students had access to online opportunities or devices at home or adequate learning environments. And only this week, literally on Monday, was there an agreement between the government and the teachers union to start gradually reopening schools. So the learning loss that we can expect between these students who were already at such different levels of just mastery of the basic skills to succeed later in life is enormous. And what we've seen, and this is actually a paper that just came out in the digital edition yesterday by the published in the Comparative Education Review, and it's in their print issue, will be in May. It's a paper I did with colleagues, former colleagues from the World Bank, where we looked at building on previous research on the returns to education and how they represent productivity gains. And therefore, if you lose on the returns to education because students are missing out on school, what is their potential for loss in productivity worldwide? Worldwide, we estimated that the loss in productivity would be 0.8% per year in GDP losses worldwide. But this distribution is quite different between high-income countries and low-income countries, as you can see in this chart, where the estimated losses as a share of GDP in low-income countries exceed 60%, whereas in high-income countries, they're under 10%. And I want to highlight that the assumptions that we took when we were doing this analysis, which took place most of last year, as many of you are researchers, you know, it takes a long time between writing the paper and then getting it out, really are a conservative estimate. We estimated that students would be out of school for at most 4 months in these estimates, and they have been, as we know now, out of school for a lot longer. I've also documented what have been across the world, the differential capacities of governments to respond. And in, for example, in May of last year, we could observe that 90% of high-income countries were offering online educational opportunities, whereas only less than 10% of low-income countries were able to do that, and they were instead relying on sort of TV, radio, technology that we know is much less able to really tailor to the student needs and to connect teachers to students more directly. What are some of the positive trends that we're observing? And we can discuss them. And they vary by country, but one of the things that we're seeing across the world, and anyone who's a parent with young children at home knows how much we now are more able to appreciate the central role that schools play in providing safe spaces, providing services such as mental health services, nutrition, in some cases for some of the most disadvantaged populations, schools are the one place where they get 1 or 2 nutritious meals, and where there's a safe place for children to be away from, for example, domestic violence and other problematic situations at home. And the second big issue we've seen is a renewed valuation of the work of educators. You know, in our piece, we talk about Argentina and Buenos Aires, where just as families were clapping when frontline workers in the health sector were returning home, they were also clapping for teachers, for example. And that is something we hadn't seen before, is this renewed valuation of the work that teachers provide. The other trend that we're seeing as a positive and that we suggest we should build on what we call the powered up school is the idea to have a school be, yes, a center for learning, but also a partner with other allies. So parents have been forced to take a new role in their children's education due to the lockdowns. But also they've, as I mentioned, grown to really understand much better what is the work that teachers do and schools do. Media and tech companies have stepped up in many places, as I mentioned, providing in very low income settings, TV and radio learning opportunities, cell phone technology to at least reach the most marginalized rural populations or populations in urban areas through texting and low cost data. And then tech companies have been, really in some ways benefiting from the need that parents have and educators to access materials online and through other tech devices to really access learning opportunities. The third area, and I know it's dear to this group, is sort of what happens with social protection and health allies. And what we've seen around the world, particularly in low-income countries and communities, is that schools were not only a place where students got learning opportunities, but then in many cases they also got health and social protection services, socio-emotional support, counseling services. And we argue that this will be ever more important when schools reopen, and as schools reopen, as many of these students and teachers, by the way, have suffered trauma at home due to the health impacts on their own families and on their own communities. And finally, civil society at large. So one of the things we're seeing, particularly in more advanced economies, in the Nordic countries, for example, is how as they reopen, they partnered with museums, with public parks, with other spaces to comply with the social distancing requirements to keep children and teachers safe, but also to provide new spaces for learning, including with employers who, for example, hotel services that had to be shut down could offer extra spaces for learning. So hopefully, and one of the arguments we put forth in our piece is that we hope these are the kinds of allies that school systems will continue to rely on and really strengthen as we move forward to a new type of education that is more tailored to both bring students up to speed, but also accelerate their learning. So what do we see as the opportunity? The first argument we make is the need to really leverage public education. And we argue that, increasingly in low and middle income countries, private schools are playing an increasing role in expanding access and have historically played an increasing role because governments have been less capable to provide services to all children as they're striving to expand access through the public education system. However, even in the best of systems where private schools have really stepped up and where even government funding has gone to support the expansion of enrollment through private school provision, public schools have remained central to equality of opportunity. They have remained the space that has to receive anyone, and in many countries have remained the school where the most disadvantaged populations are more likely to attend because they can't afford even the low-cost private schools that are being developed in many developing countries. So we argue that really for equity purposes and for and to mitigate the impact of COVID on inequality, sort of societies and especially governments should focus on channeling resources and supports to public schools. The second area is what we call a laser focus on the instructional core, and in particular in foundational and socio-emotional skills. So in education, and in particular in the US, in the late 1990s, two prominent education researchers, Deborah Ball and David Cohen, argued that the reason why so many school reform efforts in this country had failed had to do with the fact that they had focused on input solely and adding resources, but much less or insufficiently on what happened with how learners, educators, and content interacted as you increase resources. For example, as you implemented edtech solutions or reform curriculum, there was a less attention on what to expect would be the interactions in what they coined the instructional core. In our recent work, we also add the parental figure because particularly during COVID, but also research has shown that parents play an important role in mediating the interactions between learners and educators, but also between learners and content, particularly outside of school. And so we argue that as we move forward to reopen schools and we are trying to improve and catch up, and bring students up to speed in what they lost during the period of school closures and ensure that all students can continue learning, that focusing on the instructional core will be ever more important. And this is also related to our next point, which is the opportunity to harness education technology to accelerate learning. So unlike in the health sector, for example, technology up to now had not really transformed education systems in the way it has transformed almost every other sector of the economy. In a recent piece that I put out in September of last year with Alejandro Ganimian, who's an assistant professor at NYU Steinhardt School, and also Rick Hess, who's a senior fellow in the American Enterprise Institute, we argue that part of the reason why we hadn't really realized the promise of education technology to accelerate learning, particularly in low and middle income countries and communities, is because we also as a community had paid insufficient attention to the instructional core, and in particular to what we argue are the comparative advantages of technology to complement the work of teachers. So in many of the developing countries, and when sort of the one laptop per child, for example, initiative that MIT initially had at the MIT Media Lab was brought about, sort of the underlying argument was that if only every child could have access to a tablet or a laptop, they would be able to learn. And then in some ways, teachers would no longer be necessary. And they were trying, I think, with good intentions to solve a real problem in many low-income countries and communities, which is that we have a dearth of high-quality, effective teachers. However, technology can really alleviate that problem if you focus on not that, we basically what I should step back and say, the evidence has shown, 20 years later, that just giving kids laptops or teachers laptops does not do anything to improve learning. There's lots of really rigorous evaluations of the incredible failures of just the one laptop per child and other programs that have distributed devices or introduced technology without taking into consideration what it is that you're trying to achieve in terms of learning, and how are these interactions between students and content, whether it's in a device or not, or students and teachers or teachers and content, and how that's going to change as a result of the introduction of EdTech. So what we argue in our recent report is that EdTech really has four primary comparative advantages. First is that, scaling up standardized instruction. So we have some really effective teachers, and even those very effective teachers in one subject area may not be as effective in another. So the goal of having lecture-based instruction for all students, which is sort of how the traditional education systems were built, it has failed miserably, but also technology can help bring about better lectures in a scalable way, in a low-cost way to a majority of students across the world. Secondly, technology can help personalized instruction. And so we know that the importance of really meeting students at the right level where they are. And technology can help teachers, particularly teachers in low-income settings who have often more than 30 to 40 students, who normally in pre-COVID times already came with different levels of skills and learning. And now with the learning losses that have taken place in the last year or so, will be even more heterogeneous group. And so having teachers be prepared to use technology in a more effective way to differentiate and to help them manage, this heterogeneity of learning in different fields is going to be one of the areas where we think we can really effectively harness EdTech. The third area is in expanding opportunities for students to practice. So we know that we don't just learn from being exposed to content, whether it's through a lecture, a textbook, or even a laptop or the web, but really it's how we apply that knowledge into real world problems. And technology can provide a myriad of opportunities for students to practice the critical skills that they should be learning to succeed. And fourth, and very importantly, particularly as we know with young adolescents who are in many cases dropping out because they don't feel the relevance of education or they don't get excited about the way it's being delivered, technology can help increase student engagement by engaging students through play, through games, through exciting videos, and other more dynamic ways of delivering content than traditional methods. My fourth point is that we have an opportunity to foster stronger parental engagement in education. And the key issue here is that, in particular, young children spend less than 50% of their time in school. So relying on schools to be, really the hub of learning, while important, is not sufficient. And we can see what an important role, lots of research has shown parents play and sort of household characteristics play. And what's been really striking is that prior to COVID, schools were the leveler, right? They were the place where kids who were particularly at a disadvantage, because whether their parents had lower levels of education or were frontline workers or had domestic problems at home that made them less capable of supporting their children's learning, children could go to a school, and in the best of systems, the school would provide these supports. Although we know that that was also very unequally distributed and highly correlated with original household characteristics. But if we can work with parents from early childhood to really equip them with ways in which they can, at low cost, stimulate their children's cognitive skills and socio-emotional growth early on, we can do a great deal. And there's a lot of evidence of the important role in that partnership and how it can really play out, particularly for the most disadvantaged children. And my last point is that rather than thinking that we have the right model, that we should really take this opportunity to iterate, evaluate, and improve. As Siva mentioned, I've worked primarily, or in my last 20 years, in development banks, where we prepare projects and lend to governments around the world loans to implement a particular project that has been designed ex ante. And then the role of the government is to implement, and the banks to supervise that the resources are being used toward the goals that we have agreed, and to supervise the implementation. And then we would always require an evaluation of its impact. But that evaluation often started, in year 5 of the project implementation, and the results came out in year 6, when, who knows if there was still a relationship between that particular government and that particular institution. And if it failed, which in many cases, unfortunately, it did, or it didn't fully meet its desired objectives, there was very little we could do, and we had lost a lot of resources and time and really failed children. So what we argue is really, let's use improvement science from the get-go to iterate quickly, evaluate what's happening on the ground, how are children responding, and teachers to the different interventions, and then improve in real time before it's too late. And we have experiences of that at Brookings. We have a series of what we call real-time scaling labs around the world, where we partner with governments, sometimes with civil society organizations or NGOs. And in countries like Botswana, we've been able during the pandemic to really assess what's happening with learning at home through cell phone technology, very low cost, and tailor lessons that parents can provide to students. And we have evidence of how we can mitigate the learning losses using these kind of quick interventions, innovations, evaluations, and improvement. So, sorry, I should have clicked the difference. I'm just gonna conclude by saying, these are my short remarks, and I would really welcome your questions and discussion. Thank you very much. This is my email address and my social media hashtag.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Vegas, for sharing your work with us. I have so many questions, and I'm sure that many in our group also have questions. And it looks like we have a very special guest joining us also. Looks like your son is joining us today.
You missed the introduction when we mentioned him. Hi, Toby.
Welcome.
No, it's going to be mentioned. Sorry. I figured hi, send my support.
I like your sweater.
We all like your sweatshirt. Okay. So I want to ask, this is, generally a very interactive forum. So, if people are interested in submitting questions for Dr. Vegas, you can either drop them in the chat, or just use the interactive kind of Zoom functions to raise your hand, and we'll ask you to share your questions with Dr. Vegas. So a couple of questions that came up for me, and of course, given that we're part of the trauma interest work group, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has really disrupted a lot of critical kind of mental health services, some of which took place in school settings. Some of the main functions or some of the critical functions that were served by schools was the identification of children who were exposed to child maltreatment, traumatic exposures, perhaps intimate partner violence in the home. Can you share a little bit about how schools globally have been able to address children's ability to access kind of these non-academic supports while this extended period of in-person learning has been suspended?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies tremendously by country, and some have done a much better job than others, I would say. My special area where I've worked most of the time is Latin America, and I would say, countries like Uruguay were able to collaborate much closer between the education and health systems than other countries like Brazil, where, like the US, if I may say, the whole issue was very politicized. So one thing that we have seen across the board is that when decisions were made based on evidence and when the politics were removed, better decisions have tended to have been made. So Uruguay, for example, was able to have a better handle on the pandemic early on, was able to reopen schools gradually. They started with rural areas because the science showed that if you were able to social distance, and naturally in rural areas, you have less of a dense population, and then they gradually moved to urban areas. They started with the younger children who tend to need more of that in-person support. But to your specific question, I think I would, say a blanket statement that I don't think that has been very well done, and in particular in the poorest of countries in Africa and in India, for example, in Southeast Asia. What we're seeing is the very unequal impact on girls. Lots of girls who have, for cultural reasons or for just abuse reasons, have more responsibilities at home, or are being forced to marry as teenagers because of the costs of retaining them at home and the loss of income that these families are suffering. So this is really an issue that we are going to have to study and really look at the lasting impact of. On the positive side, I mean, we are seeing these incredible organizations that were civil society organizations in India and Africa that have really stepped up to the platter to try and raise awareness, to try and reach, communities. They are grassroots organizations. But they too, this morning I was meeting with one really great leader from India who was saying, that her whole organization is 400 people across rural India, and she had to tell them all to take a week off next week because they're all burnt out, and also the pandemic has taken a turn for the worse in India, and they're all under lockdown and really concerned. Everybody has suffered a close relative either getting seriously ill or unfortunately passing away. So it's really taking a huge toll on communities around the world.
Absolutely. Actually, I'm glad that you brought up some of the kind of disproportionate impacts in terms of gender in different kind of communities and different countries. That was actually one of the questions I had is, you mentioned in your presentation about the loss of GDP associated with kind of learning loss. And I was wondering a bit about the inverse. What about the economic impacts of COVID-19 and how that impacts the ability of children to be able to attend school? How is that being looked at and studied? And can you share a little bit about your thoughts about that?
It's interesting because one of the things that we're seeing is that even in countries with high levels of GDP and low inequality, like the Netherlands, there's been huge learning loss, and it's been highly unequal, even though the country had similar conditions. And it has to do with these issues of what else is going on at home that's unrelated in some cases to the economy, but in many of the more low-income countries, the economic losses to families, in some ways, what we're seeing in the short term may have been lower than in high-income countries because of the great proportion of poor people in low-income countries who work in the informal economy, and who have been forced, frankly, to continue to work. So countries like
Mhm.
Mexico, Brazil, India, they didn't shut down to the extent that we had to in the US because they frankly couldn't afford to.
Mhm.
And so the per capita in absolute value loss may have been lower, but in a proportionate sense, it's much higher. And that's what we see in our paper, that when you compare the total loss in absolute values in high income countries, it is in some ways greater because they shut down their economies, quicker and to a greater extent. And it's interesting. I think there's still a lot of research that needs to happen. Nobel economist Angus Deaton from Princeton wrote an interesting piece arguing that inequality may actually, across countries, may actually be reduced as a result of COVID because the poorer countries kept their economies somewhat moving forward, whereas the wealthier countries did not. But I think I argue that doesn't take it into account the sort of differential impact at the kind of proportional. What does that mean proportionally, right? So for someone who earns $100,000 a year, to lose 1 year of earning has much less impact than for someone who earns $100 a year to lose that same amount.
Absolutely. And that actually is a nice segue into my next question, which has to do with disproportionate impacts in kind of communities that are low resource, which often may be the ones who are more likely to experience kind of potentially traumatic events. Can you say a little bit about kind of the disproportionate impacts on incomes with limited resource or low resource communities kind of globally?
Well, the first thing we're seeing is, that because, 1.6 billion kids were left out of school and schools, which is unprecedented. We had never seen school closures at this scale. The importance of what was the alternative was very different depending on where you sit, whether it's in a high income country and you're in a low income community that doesn't have access to technology or data because it's too expensive, whether your family only has one device that is shared among the parents who are working as well as the students who need to learn, or you're in a low income country where less than 50% of the population to begin with has access to any sort of connectivity. So we're seeing, I think one of the interesting things is we've seen that inequality, which was there, but that schools in some way helped to mitigate, because when kids could go to school and schools had some sort of equipment, and in general, many countries prioritize connectivity for schools, labs, computer labs, there was a little bit of an opportunity to mitigate the huge inequality. COVID has just laid it bare and also increased it because, as I mentioned early on, sort of the quality of the teachers and the instruction that takes place in high income communities tends to be higher to begin with. And so then even if no school, even the best schools, and I would argue even in Chicago, right, in the spring of last year had been prepared to be a fully online institution. And, not all the teachers and even the best institutions knew how to teach online. And it's very different to do that well than, as you know, in person, where you can see the student's body language much better, et cetera. So in the best of institutions, the abrupt impact of having to shut down and do everything online was already a challenge, and we all know that. But then when you combine that with the fact that, there were many institutions that had no history of working online whatsoever, no capacity in their teachers to use devices or deliver education, and then in many cases, not even the opportunity to do so because of lack of connectivity and devices. And what we're seeing is really very troubling. And like I said, our paper that just came out yesterday is just a lower bound estimate of the huge impact that this will have for generations to come. Oh, you're on mute.
What do you think is the most critical impact that you would say is the effect of this kind of gap in learning and learning loss?
So I think for the younger children, I think we're going to have to, as a global community, really focus on getting them at least the foundational skills of reading and numeracy so they can continue learning, as well as, the socio-emotional support. You know this better than me as a health professional, and many of you are working in psychiatry and psychology, but schools really are a space for more than learning those basic skills. They're a place where kids socialize and learn to share and behave in a way that's socially beneficial for everyone. And so having had them, isolated for over a year is going to have potential lasting impacts. I'm not totally pessimistic because I think that there are some positives. I think the fact that as I think there's a bigger awareness of the toll that this has taken on everyone, and so hopefully there, some schools maybe paid less attention to socio-emotional health, and will now hopefully pay more attention to that. And in fact, I see some early on in the pandemic, the education community was meeting very regularly, worried about sort of the learning loss. And I remember hearing from many experts saying, let's not worry about learning loss. That's not the key issue. It's the socio-emotional toll that this is taking. So, the learning losses are an easy way to quantify because socio-emotional, well-being is so hard to measure and to then translate into dollars. But we do know that reading and math, and education sort of skills, we can translate more easily. There are methods to do that, and that's but it's definitely an underestimate.
Well, there's no question that globally we have a profound renewed respect for educators and the function that they serve for our young people. And thank you so much for sharing these insights. I'd like to at this time open up to the group for any questions. Raise your hand, drop a question in the chat. We have a wonderful expert here, so let's use this opportunity to ask our burning questions. Dr. Dinizulu.
Hi, Dr. Vegas. Thanks so much for agreeing to present for the Trauma and Just Work Group series, and for presenting a global perspective, which I'm not often exposed to enough. So I'm curious about, I do a lot of work with trying to engage parents and, promoting mental health and wellness for their kids in community-based settings. And it's usually in community-based settings where there's not a lot of resources, so it's under-resourced, poverty at times. So I'm wondering, just globally and locally, meaning the states, what are the different ways to get parents engaged? You mentioned that as a mediator. We have thrown, for example, we'll pay for childcare. We'll do transportation, trying to deal with all the barriers that might prevent them from physically coming someplace to from their neighborhood to the University of Chicago, for example, I'm making this up. And so, parents have the best intentions and they want to engage, but I find it's always a struggle. So that's my perspective locally in the city of Chicago. I'm interested in knowing, what does parental engagement look like globally, and how can we learn from global some of their perspectives?
So
if you have some information about that.
You froze a little bit there at the end, but I think I got the gist of your question. I'll give you a couple of examples, again, from the Latin America region where I'm more familiar. So in Colombia, which is a federal system and one of the larger in terms of population in the region, there's a national Ministry of Education, as well as state level secretaries of education, similar to the US. But the national minister there has, I would say, more influence than in the US in terms of the financing of the system as a whole and setting policy. And one of the things they've done, they always had sort of an organization that was sort of like the equivalent in the US of the PTAs of all the schools. But during COVID, they really worked hard to engage with them and have, as a result, I think, had a much better process of communicating what is available for parents to use while they're at home. The vice minister currently was a woman who came from running their early childhood development initiative, which is one of the more successful in the region. So she was accustomed to working with families and communities, and she was charged by the minister to do this sort of deepening of the relationship. And I think at one point they were having weekly or biweekly meetings with representatives from the parent organizations across all states to really see, well, what is it that you can find online and through, what is it that families families are finding useful, and how can we better serve them while we're in a remote setting. And I wouldn't say this worked perfectly, but I think it's an example of some of the things that is government led, but also civil society engaged, let's say, and parents very engaged. The other one that I would say that I was familiar with when I was heading the education division at the Inter-American Development Bank was an effort to, particularly in the poorest neighborhoods of the Dominican Republic, where there's high rates of teenage pregnancy and sort of very young parents, provide services that were tailored to parents, let's say, depending on how much time they could invest. So these were community centers where there were, in some cases, childcare services provided, as well as, let's say, a 1 hour, you just drop in with your baby and you're going to have a trained specialist help you work with very simple games or ways of engaging your child in cognitive kind of stimulation activities, and also take that opportunity to also ask them around, how well is your child being fed? Let's, make sure you understand how important it is, for example, for the mother to provide natural lactation as opposed to powdered milk, etc. So, and everything in between. You had, what I loved about this and visiting them was that you'd see these really young parents, including fathers, sitting on the floor with their babies, trying to stimulate it. And in a very poor country, in a poor community like the Dominican Republic, I really expect that this will have a huge impact in the long run, not in the short run, but in the long run. We also saw great investments in childcare, sort of early childhood education centers, to try to change the perception that many educators have in the region and in other developing regions, that kids who are starting school and preschool or even before need to behave like school-aged children, and really try to embed this idea that play is a valid way of engaging kids and having them learn. Structured play is a very important way for kids to learn, and a more effective way when they're so young. And so all of these are sort of examples that I can tell you from around the world that we've seen. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you. That was really insightful and informative. I would like to hear from anyone else who's interested in asking Dr. Vegas a question. Feel free to use your.
Well, if no one said, can I ask you a question? In this series, I understand you're having quite a few people like myself from a different sector. Can you tell me what's been some of the more important sort of insights that you think you've been able to garner?
Trauma interest work group.
I'm super interested in learning from you as well.
People want to share what they found to be valuable in our series.
I think we're just formulating a response. So
Looks like Dr. Norcott has some ideas. Thank you, Dr. Norcott.
Well, that's generous, but I was just going to say that Sonia, Dr. Dinizulu really prompted you to ask the topic that I wanted to hear more about. So thank you for your really thoughtful answer about kind of engaging in some low-hanging fruit for parents, and ways to engage parents. I think the connectivity and the connection that I think has been a theme, right? Like the ways in which people have on a local level and just independently connected to provide resources to each other has been one of the opportunities and the really powerful pieces of coping with this pandemic. And so it's, I don't really necessarily have any insights or thoughts, but it's just been something that I felt like is something that's emerged. I feel like some of the, especially in Chicago, some of the best parts of Chicago is, yes, we have all of these unique challenges as the city, but what it does is it inspires individual and local level activism. That's really beautiful. And I think that hopefully that what's emerged around school and education will continue, and we'll take some of these things on. I work a lot in reproductive health, and so what you were talking about with kind of the impact on girls, I think is powerful. And I'm not sure, I don't really know where the question is in this, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about if it will shift how families look going forward, because if girls are being kind of marginalized earlier, or siphoned into these roles earlier, how will that impact who's parenting down the line, how family structures look, and then what that means for education. If you can find a prompt in there that's inspiring, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But yeah, those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. So thank you for your talk.
Thank you. Well, we have in our center, one of our flagship programs is called the Echidna Scholars Program. And we have for many years now brought 4 individuals from low income or middle income countries who are working already in the sort of the girls' education sphere. And we bring them for a 4 to 6 month period where we try to build on their ability to translate evidence into policy impact. And so kind of research, we don't want to build researchers, we want people who can understand research and translate it into policy impact. And then also leaders. And so we have a big leadership component there. And our theory of change is that they're already influential, but that this experience will really transform them into much more impactful individuals, both locally as well as through the global connection that they'll get by being at Brookings for a few months, connecting with other institutions that do work in the global girls' education space, and with the network of alumni from the program, which has now grown to over 30 in over 18 countries around the world. And so I've learned a lot through this program. And one of the things that we are talking a lot about is sort of the need to not just empower girls and give them job-specific skills, which is the focus of a lot of the programs, but really what we are calling girls' agency. So building their agency to make the decisions about their education trajectory, about their reproductive health, about their family. And that's a huge shift and really culturally different depending on the setting. So I don't know if this responds to your question, but the shift between empowering girls and giving them agency is something that we're thinking a lot about.
Thank you. That is actually something that I think we would all like to hear a bit more about. One of the things that you had mentioned was related to kind of engaging parents, and picking up on the threads that Dr. Norcott and Dr. Dinizulu shared. I'm wondering, if we're talking about parents, are we talking about engaging mothers versus fathers more? And if we're seeing that the parents who are involved in kind of the providing the education that, has been kind of more of their role since in-school learning has not been as available, how are we mitigating kind of burnout that parents may feel in navigating all of these different responsibilities that they've had over the past year, especially if the burden disproportionately is falling on perhaps mothers or girls who are not being allowed to go to school and then having to take on more of the burdens at home, especially in those spaces where, families may be more predominantly essential workers or kind of unable to do kind of remote working or work from home. How are people thinking about kind of the impact on gender across the lifespan with parental engagement in school learning?
I mean, that's a really good question. And one of my colleagues, Beth King, who's a resident scholar with us and former global director of education with the World Bank, she's been doing a lot of work on how sort of the distribution of household responsibilities is shifting as a result of COVID. And for example, looking at a comparative study in several countries, primarily low and middle income countries as well, where, the pandemic has really been terrible, I think, in the, in low and disadvantaged populations, and particularly where the cultural norm is that the female, shares the biggest burden of child caring, household provision, etc. And so, one of the things that we're observing, I think worldwide, and it's also being documented in the US, is that moms are more likely to quit jobs because they
Mhm.
can't manage, I'm so glad that Toby is my oldest and his brother is already a senior in high school. I don't know how I would have done it if they were in school age and couldn't go to school and I had to have a full-time job. And so, clearly I would have probably had to also take time off, and that would have affected my income and probably my own power dynamics with respect to my partner at home, and et cetera. So I think that's one thing that is of great concern. The other thing of concern is again the impact on sort of the girls in the household who are more likely to mimic and be expected to contribute more to the household. One positive thing though is, through one of our Echidna alumni, or one of the organizations that she runs, I believe it's in India as well, is that they basically provide training to mothers and fathers around what it means to be an equal partner. And one of the exercises that they reported, which was super interesting, was to have parents volunteer to exchange roles for one day. And so in some communities, the father would find himself having to fetch water, to cook the meals, to look after the kid, while the mom was sitting down and drinking and saying to the father, in this exchange of roles, go look after so-and-so because I'm busy, And so that's really changed the dynamics in the household, just that opportunity to have one day of shifting roles for the parents, or the male figure in this case, better understand, and it trickled down to the boys, who then really kind of got a better understanding of how unfair it was that their sisters were doing much more of the household chores, and they were able to focus better on school, for example.
Fascinating study. All right, I think we're about short of time. Are there any last minute questions? Oh, don't think of questions, but we have a reminder. Before we kind of say our thank yous to Dr. Vegas, please take a few seconds to participate in our audience survey. It's in the chat. And at this time, I would like to really share our appreciation and our gratitude to you, Dr. Vegas, for sharing your insights with us on this really important topic today.
Thank you
so much for
having
joining us.
me, and congrats on all the great work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.